everybody, this is Jerry Reed, also known as Barbecue 17. Thanks for taking time out from your multiverse to hang out in my universe today as we talk about DC Comics. This is my first time ever attempting to do a one-man podcast. You may recognize my voice from the Confirmed Epic podcast, which is the official podcast of the epicreview.com, where myself and the real Brad Bell and a number of other folks have been podcasting since 2013 on a variety of subjects. Well, this is my own podcast, and as I said earlier, it's going to be a one-man podcast. It's something I've kind of flirted with. I've thought about what I wanted to do with it, and finally I decided that what I wanted to do was a podcast where I talked about various comics in DC history. This actually spins out of a bizarre little New Year's resolution that I made for myself. You know, some people decide that they want to lose weight. Some people want to try to, get into some kind of hobby or do yoga or something like that. And I decided that my New Year's resolution for 2018 was that I wanted to read, or start reading at least, all of the major DC Comics crossover events from post-Crisis on Infinite Earths up until Flashpoint. So yeah, this is kind of my bizarre little New Year's resolution. I'm a DC fan. I don't know that a lot of people have interest in this podcast. I certainly hope that they do, but I'm kind of doing this for myself, and I'm hoping a few of y'all out there enjoy listening to it as well. So, I actually don't always listen to a lot of podcasts myself. I know that sounds really crazy, but there's a few podcasts that I do listen to from time to time. If I'm traveling, or sometimes if I'm doing some data entry at my job, I do like to have something on. And I certainly love to have a podcast on that's, something that I enjoy. Especially if it's just something that I really like, and I can just kind of sit there and appreciate it and, immerse myself in something that I find enjoyable and relaxing, or fun and stimulating. And one of the things that I really, really enjoy is DC Comics. I'm a big DC Comics fan. I know on the Confirmed Epic podcast a lot of the time, Brad makes it sound like that I hate Marvel. I do not hate Marvel. Please not come after me. But I have pretty much focused the majority of my comics reading on DC Comics. And first of all, that's because of my love for Batman and Batgirl and Batwoman and all of the members of the Bat family. It's actually how I really started getting into reading comics pretty seriously, was after seeing Batman Begins in 2005, which made me really interested in going back and tracking down some of the Batman stories. Now, I grew up reading comics here and there. There weren't many comics that I probably read very seriously. I certainly remember reading the Batman Adventures, which was based off of the Batman the Animated Series cartoon in the early 90s. There were various other comics. I certainly read X-Men in the early 90s. I would read a little bit of DC here and there, and various other things. But in 2005, I really started getting heavy into DC Comics, and I've been reading DC Comics ever since. And so I have a study at my house that's one of my little hobby rooms, and it's one of the rooms where I keep all of my DC Comics, and I have shelves and shelves and shelves of collected trade paperbacks, which is my favorite way to read comics. I really like these collected editions. So anyway, what I've decided to do with this podcast is to take each episode and to look at one major crossover event in DC Comics. For right now, this podcast is looking at things post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, or whom you abbreviate that as post-Crisis, which is one of the ways that folks talk about DC history. So that's anything after Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985, early 1986. And my goal is to go all the way up through Flashpoint, which is the event that ends post-Crisis continuity in DC Comics and sets the way for the New 52, which came about in 2011. And I do hope I'm right on some of these dates. Again, I have tried to make myself a lot of notes here, especially being that this is a one-person show. But I will let people know I am not a walking encyclopedia. Sometimes on the podcast, people make jokes about that with knowledge of DC Comics or Star Wars or whatnot, but I know that I will make mistakes. I will have these podcasts probably posted a number of places, but the best way to get in touch with me is to leave me a message on the post at actionfigurebarbecue.com. That's actionfigure, BARBECUE.com. Feel free to comment, point out mistakes that I've made. Again, that's just one of the ways that we learn. But as I said, I really think this could be a fun podcast. A few reasons I decided to do this. Again, one, this is kind of my own pet project right now, is to read through all of these major events. And I figure if I talk about them and make notes about them and try to explain them to someone else, I'm going to remember them a little bit better and process them a little bit more as well. Two, as I said earlier, I like listening to things that I enjoy hearing about. And so I hope that if you're listening to this, that you enjoy DC Comics, and maybe you are far more of an expert and far more qualified than I am, or maybe you're just getting into DC Comics, or maybe you're somebody who, I know a lot of folks like this, that maybe will go see the movies, or they'll watch some of the TV shows that are on right now, and then they'll be interested in how the stories stack up to what was in the comics. I have a lot of folks will come up and ask me about that. How accurate was, this to the comics or that to the comics. So maybe if this is something you're interested in, well, you can kind of learn a little bit about DC history and some of the major events. Quick spoiler, there are not many DC movies that adhere to the comics in the same way that the Marvel movies do. Marvel really uses their storylines quite a bit. DC doesn't do that very much at all with their movies, at least with the DCEU films that are going on right now. So, today, we're going to be starting off talking about Legends. Legends is the first major crossover event that happened after Crisis on Infinite Earths, but I'm going to assume, just for a moment, that you may not quite know what Crisis on Infinite Earths is. Now, I know that most comic fans absolutely know what Crisis on Infinite Earths is. You've probably read it before, but I'm assuming there are a couple folks here that maybe are interested or in listening that don't know what it is. So, lots of people have talked about Crisis on Infinite Earths. I didn't start here. I've read the book a number of times over the years. I actually just reread it this past summer again. Summer of 2017, I picked it up at one point. Again, if you're just reading the issues, Crisis on Infinite Earths is 12 issues long. Of course, it's an older comic, so I feel like it's a little bit more dense. There's absolutely a lot more writing and a lot more story that seems to take place in the older comics in a shorter span of time. But if we're going to talk about Legends, if we're going to start this podcast and talk about DC history post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, I do feel that I have to in some way address Crisis on Infinite Earths. So let's assume for a second that there's a couple of you out there who don't know what Crisis on Infinite Earths is. At this point, I'm just going to call it Crisis. Crisis came out in April of 1985. It was 12 issues, so it ran through March of 1986. 12 issues, right? Doesn't sound like a lot. Crisis affected everything in the DC universe, so it had a lot of tie-ins. Crisis was the main book. It was a title you could pick up each month, but a number of other DC titles tied into Crisis as well. If you really look at it, there's over 100 titles that tie into Crisis. No, I have not read them all. That's a lot of titles. Crisis overall, you'd say it's by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, who, if there's two names that are absolutely the epitome of maybe the 1980s DC era, it's these guys, Marv Wolfman and George Perez. Why Crisis? Why is it so important? Over the years, things got really crazy with DC Comics, and their continuity made no sense at times. See, here's the thing. DC Comics characters were around since the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. And over time, some of them had multiple origin stories. Some of them had histories where they had action in World War II, and yet they still seem to be in their peak physical prime in the 1970s and early 1980s. DC acquired a lot of comics companies over the years. When comics companies would go out or they would have characters up for sale, DC would pick up those characters and try to move them into their books. There were legacy characters, characters who would, assume the identity that another character had. Things got really messy. And so as DC was approaching its 50th anniversary, they decided that they had to clean things up. They really had to make things easier for new readers, for people to jump on and make the DC universe make sense again. So, Crisis on Infinite Earths led to multiple character deaths. There were reboots of characters, and overall, it was a simplification of DC Comics. Crisis had a mission, so in a way, it's a good story, but its purpose was kind of utilitarian as well. There was a point to Crisis, and that was to simplify things. So the biggest thing that comes out of Crisis is at the end, there was no longer a multiverse. Now don't worry, DC has brought back the multiverse multiple times since then. But at the end of Crisis, there was no longer a multiverse. So, what the heck is the multiverse? The multiverse is this concept that's been around in DC Comics since the Golden Age. You can find it in the 1930s, 1940s, even in 1950s comics. And it was this idea that there's multiple parallel worlds that differ in some way from each other, but sometimes they contain different versions of the same characters. There might be two Supermans, a Superman that lives on Earth 1 and a Superman that lives on Earth 2, or there's all kinds of different worlds. In 1956, which we would say is the beginning of the Silver Age of comics, there were lots of reboots that were happening. DC was rebooting a lot of their Golden Age superheroes. Now, characters like Superman and Batman, they really didn't do a lot of rebooting. They just kept upgrading them and kind of modernizing them a little bit. But there were a lot of characters that DC would keep the name and the general concept, but that hero would have a completely new identity. Take the Flash. The original Golden Age Flash is a guy named Jay Garrick. He looks different than the Flash that we're accustomed to. He has a different name than Barry Allen or Wally West, which are different Flashes that come later on. And he has really, in a lot of ways, a different set of powers. But in 1956, DC gave the Flash a new identity. He had a new look. He was now Barry Allen. He had a whole new origin story. So whatever happened to the Golden Age Flash? Same goes with Green Lantern. The Alan Scott Green Lantern of the Golden Age is incredibly different than the Hal Jordan Green Lantern. You don't read a lot of comics. Hal Jordan is the guy that Ryan Reynolds played in the Green Lantern movie. That probably the reason why we don't have a Green Lantern in the Justice League movie that just came out. Anyways, it's a lot of confusing stuff. So DC published a story to try to make things a little bit simpler. Now, there was a long history of this. In 1963, DC published a story called Crisis on Earth 1 that was followed by a story, Crisis on Earth 2. These came out in Justice League of America number 21 and 22. And so the idea was that the Justice League of America, who was part of Earth 1, this was kind of the modern Justice League at the time, they met up with the JSA, the Justice Society of America, which were the Golden Age heroes as well. So these two sets of heroes, the heroes from the comics in the 30s, 40s, they were on one Earth, Earth 2, and the more modern heroes of the 50s and 60s were on Earth 1, sort of the main Earth. So DC had this history of having all of these characters join up. So the title for Crisis on Infinite Earths was inspired by these earlier Silver Age stories where multiple heroes would come together to stop some threat. It's pretty much what happens on Crisis on Infinite Earths, just in a larger scale. A bunch of heroes from multiple worlds, from multiple time periods, characters that DC created, characters that DC bought over the years as other companies went out of business. they all are joining together to stop the threat of this being called the Anti-Monitor, who is destroying multiple realities in order to become the sole ruler of everything. I guarantee you, people listening to this podcast at some point will come back and we'll talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths in a little bit more detail and depth. But at the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the crisis is resolved. Multiple Earths from all over the multiverse merge together into one. The Anti-Monitor dies, but there were also a lot of heroes that died as well. Most famously, Supergirl dies. Of course, if you look anywhere, you realize Supergirl is back, because not many people stay dead in comics. And Barry Allen, who was the Silver Age Flash, well, he died as well. Legends was born out of Crisis on Infinite Earths. The back of the book, there's actually I'm carrying right now the Legends. It's called the 30th Anniversary Edition. It has all 6 issues in it, and it has a really cool little I guess you'd call it an end note or something. Afterword is what it's called, by Mike Gold, who is the former group editor, director of development for DC Comics. Mike Gold was the editor for this project, and Mike Gold in the afterword of the current version that's available of Legends to purchase talks about that one of the things he used when he was trying to get people to join the team for Legends was that he actually had access to issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths before the book was finished. DC was already working on this big crossover event, this big story Legends, before Crisis was even finished. So Legends was released in November of 1986 through May of 1987. It's only 6 issues. Came out less than a year after Crisis on Infinite Earths. If you want to talk about a pretty crazy time for comics, also during that time, The Dark Knight Returns was released. Those 4 issues came out, and Watchmen had just started. Alan Moore's Watchmen had just seen its first issue released in September of 1986. So if you want to talk about a crazy time for DC Comics, 1986 definitely seems to be the year. We might talk about things in DC Comics, being post-crisis after 1985, but if we want to talk about the reality of DC changing everything in comics, really 1986 that seems to be the really big deal. So, a little bit about Legends, kind of the technical things, was plotted by John Ostrander. He had a long history working with DC. In more recent years, he actually did a lot of stuff with all the Dark Horse Star Wars titles, which we know those are back at Marvel now, but John Ostrander did a lot of stuff with the Dark Horse Star Wars titles. So he kind of had the overall storyline, but Len Wein really did the plotting. I think Mike Gold calls him a dialogist, not really sure how I should say that. But he talks about in the book, in the afterword, how important it is if you're writing this big crossover event that you need a writer who writes dialogue for dozens of characters. And this book has dozens of characters. But all that dialogue has to sound like those characters. Again, if those characters, the way they're written has, if they have special ways that they're written, they have certain ways that they speak or things that they say, well, the reader's going to expect those things. And so he picked Len Wein because he thought Len Wein had so much experience. If you look at Len Wein's work, and sadly, I think Len Wein just passed away in September of 2017, but Len Wein was a creator or co-creator of lots of characters. Probably most famously Wolverine, but he also was a co-creator of Swamp Thing, Nightcrawler, Storm, Colossus, creator of Lucius Fox, Batman's confidant, and one of the big wigs at Wayne Enterprises or Wayne Industries. Len Wein also was an editor for Watchmen as well. So Mike Gold, again, the editor who was over this project overall, was had just come to DC. This was like his first project at DC. He had actually founded a company called First Comics or he was a co-founder of First Comics a few years prior, before he made his way over to DC. So what is Legends? Well, if Crisis on Infinite Earths was about breaking down and renovating the DC universe and making it simple, then Legends is really about helping the DC universe to move all the familiar stuff back in. A lot of characters hadn't appeared yet. Crisis left a lot of things unclear. Who was going to show up? What was the status of things? And Legends really helps with that a bit. So, let's get in and let's talk about Legends. Let's get into talking about Legends and talking about the story. So I was trying to think about the best way to do this. Ultimately, my hope is that you would go and track down a copy. It's not very hard to find. DC just released a 30th anniversary edition of the book. Maybe last year, the year before. I'm kind of pulling out my copy here and looking again. Looks like 2016, so they released it in 2016. Retails are about $17.99. I'm sure you can get a better deal on that somewhere if you're looking around or shopping around a bit or using your comic shop or something. But, again, there's lots of y'all out there, I'm sure, who have not read Legends that don't have access to it. So I want to go through and talk about the story a little bit. I feel that Legends has overall a pretty simple story. For a DC crossover, this is a very simple story. One of the things that makes it seem a little bit more complicated, or maybe complex, is just that there's lots of characters. And really, it's just about establishing new teams. Again, Legends is not as utilitarian, I don't think, as Crisis on Infinite Earths is, but it really does have this purpose of establishing like a new Justice League and launching a number of titles. And I think as we talk about it, that you'll probably see what I'm talking about. So, story starts off on Apocalypse. Darkseid has decided to attempt to destroy the very concept of Legends in order to further bring about order. Darkseid, he loves order. He loves everything being under his control and everything being in its proper place. And Darkseid just keeps seeing that the presence of heroes and legends are just too chaotic for him. The DC heroes absolutely represent this very essence of legends and heroes and things that people put their hope in. And so Darkseid's plan is to destroy them. Darkseid is a villain who was created by Jack Kirby, by Jack the King Kirby. He was originally created for the Fourth World Omnibus. He rules the planet Apocalypse, and something interesting you may or may not know, I didn't know this until I did the research, Jack Kirby based Darkseid's face on the actor Jack Palance. Jack Palance played Carl Grissom in the 1989 Batman film. He was Curly in the City Slickers movies. He had a long career before those films, but there's a local Chinese restaurant where I live that actually has used to have a signed autographed picture of Jack Palance from apparently sometime he came through and visited the restaurant. Darkseid is a Jack Kirby creation. A lot of people compare him to Thanos, sort of a similar build, similar type in a lot of ways. But he really has branched out. He started branching out at this point, becoming a threat, not just in Jack Kirby's Fourth World Omnibus, but a threat to the DC Universe overall. So Darkseid has this plan, and he's going to use two of his minions, Glorious Godfrey and Dr. Bedlam. Dr. Bedlam is this character that, again, all these characters from Apocalypse are typically created by Jack Kirby. Dr. Bedlam is this character who is made from, I want to say he's made from like psionic energy. I think that's absolutely what the comic says. And so he can put his life essence, his presence into robotic bodies or other creatures and whatnot. So if the things he controls gets destroyed, oh well, they can bring him back. Glorious Godfrey is a little bit more of an interesting character. He is this person whose power is persuasion. He first appears in the very 1970s Forever People comic. Forever People #3, in fact. And Glorious Godfrey is able to persuade people. He was based by Jack Kirby on a number of different characters. Reverend Billy Graham actually passed away this past week, and in some ways he was based on Billy Graham because he was the Glorious Godfrey. Of course, Glorious Godfrey is evil, but he is this charismatic person who, his voice is persuasive. In this story, Glorious Godfrey takes on the persona of G. Gordon Godfrey, obviously based on G. Gordon Liddy, one of those involved and sentenced to prison in the Watergate break-ins. So Darkseid's plan is Dr. Bedlam is going to start undermining people's love and trust in superheroes by causing chaos and bringing about, collateral damage, while Glorious Godfrey and his G. Gordon Godfrey persona, he's a character who supposedly has written a book called Superhero or Super Menace. He's a noted psychologist. He's going to be using his powers of persuasion to start a campaign against superheroes. So what happens? In New York City, Brimstone, who this is his first appearance, he's a construct by Darkseid. He's this giant, fiery creature who spits a lot of fire and brimstone-like language. Brimstone is sent to New York, and he starts, crushing things and causing problems, and Firestorm is nearby. And so Firestorm tries to engage him, and Brimstone is too much for Firestorm, the nuclear man, to handle. And so other people are going to have to deal with Brimstone. Cosmic Boy also tries to take Brimstone down, but he fails as well. So who is Cosmic Boy? I will admit, Cosmic Boy falls into a part of DC Comics history and lore that I am not very familiar with. He is part of the Legion of Superheroes. Cosmic Boy actually got his own little 4-issue miniseries after Legends, which I don't know if it's been collected or not. I haven't been able to find it yet. But he's able to generate these magnetic fields. But anyways, the Legion of Superheroes are these superheroes from the 30th and 31st century. Cosmic Boy is a Brailian. His name is Rock Kryn, and he is time traveling back to the 1980s. He's super excited that he's eating in a diner, and he tries to take on Brimstone as well. He has a friend, girlfriend or whatnot, I can't remember, but she's running around as well, and so he's kind of worried about her. He tries to take on Brimstone, and anyways, the Justice League of America shows up. Now, this is a very different Justice League of America. Again, post-crisis at this point, we really haven't had all of the main superheroes meet up yet. So this Justice League is made up of Vibe, who is, he's Vibe. I mean, he's definitely not an A-lister that you typically think of as being on the Justice League. He didn't hang around the Justice League long. His name's Paco Ramon, and he was a leader of a gang called Los Lobos, and he has some kind of vibration-based powers or something. Vixen's on this team. Now, Vixen has become a pretty prominent character since then, but Vixen's on this team. Ralph Dibny, the Elongated Man, who has very stretchy powers. Of course, he predates Mr. Fantastic by about a year to a year and a half. Gypsy, so she's a fairly new character at the time. I think she first appeared in 1984. Commander Steel, who was a classic character. This is the grandson version of him, and I believe the Martian Manhunter is one of the others. Probably the biggest name on that team would absolutely be the Martian Manhunter. This is the Justice League of America that shows up to help Cosmic Boy. Now we take a little bit of a different turn here in the story. It's in Manhattan, it's on Wall Street, and the Flash is currently fighting Deadshot. Now, this is not Barry Allen. This is not the classic Silver Age Flash, or the Flash who becomes, more popular later on. This is Wally West. again, one of the things that happened in Crisis on Infinite Earths was the death of Barry Allen. And so Wally West steps up and assumes the mantle of the Flash at this point. So he is the Flash. He takes down Deadshot. Remember Deadshot, one of those classic Batman villains? That's the guy that Will Smith plays in the Suicide Squad movie. And Deadshot gets arrested, and he ends up in jail. Yep. So something kind of happening off to the side. Again, we're kind of setting up these characters and, getting them where we need to get them. So the next thing that happens in this story is Billy Batson is introduced. Who is Billy Batson? Billy Batson is Captain Marvel, or you may know him better now as Shazam. Marvel Comics has a Captain Marvel as well. So in 2011, after all kinds of craziness and whatnot, DC Comics finally named the character Shazam. Or Shazam is what Billy Batson says when he turns into Captain Marvel. You probably have absolutely seen Captain Marvel or Shazam. If you don't recognize him, he wears a red, very classic-looking superhero outfit with a gold and white or yellow and white cape, and he's got the lightning bolt on him. But when he yells Shazam, that acronym that means Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, Mercury, Billy Batson, who's originally this young homeless newsboy, becomes the mighty Shazam. He grows up as well. He doesn't just transform into a more powerful version of himself. He grows up as well. Shazam has a super important history. He is the most popular comic book character of the 1940s. During the 1940s, Captain Marvel, I call him Shazam because let's be honest, that's what I've always called him. But Captain Marvel is his technical name. He was at the time. Now it's legitimately Shazam. But most popular, he outsold Superman in the 1940s. He's one of those Fawcett Comics characters that DC acquired in 1972. And so that's when he entered the DC universe. This is his first appearance, though. And so while in his original origins, Captain Marvel, Billy Batson, is a homeless newsboy, in this new series, he's a young news personality. He hosts some kind of a interview show, and he's actually interviewing G. Gordon Godfrey about superheroes. And so obviously, being a superhero himself, they have a very different, he's not letting on to that, but it's a heated interview. But the power goes out because there's an attack from Macro Man. You shouldn't know who Macro Man is, because he's basically Dr. Bedlam, just, in some kind of control. I'm pretty confident this is the only thing Macro Man ever has appeared in. And so he's attacking things. Billy Batson slips out. He becomes Captain Marvel, and he goes and he gets into a fight with Macro Man, and Macro Man is crushing him. And so this sounds like a really terrible plan, but Captain Marvel decides that if he changes back, and when he changes, there's a big lightning bolt. When he changes back, he'll shrink down in size, back to being a kid, and he'll slip out of Macro Man's grip. So he does it. And the lightning bolt causes Macro Man to explode, killing Macro Man. Yep. In front of a lot of people, Captain Marvel just killed a guy. Now again, you may think, well, it's a giant robot monster attacking a city. Well, maybe it's due to Glorious Godfrey's persuasion. Maybe it's due to just being that he's supposed to be a great superhero. But everybody's like, oh snap, Captain Marvel just killed a guy and splattered him all over the place. Turns out, again, this is part of Darkseid's plot. Macro Man was packed with explosives. Dr. Bedlam's consciousness had filled him. And so it was planned to make Captain Marvel look like a murderer. Lots of crazy stuff going on here. Lots of crazy stuff. The last thing we have that happens here is that Colonel Rick Flag, is called in by a government operative named Amanda Waller to talk about creating Task Force X, also known as the Suicide Squad. This is the first appearance of Amanda Waller. She is an intimidating figure in this appearance. I really liked her being played by Viola Davis in the Suicide Squad movie. I know a lot of people do not like that movie. I do pretty much like that movie, and I thought Viola Davis did a great job. But Amanda Waller is just a frightening, even a physically large presence in this. Of course, Colonel Rick Flag, again, I mean, he is a military man through and through at the top of his game, and he still sort of has to, submit to Amanda Waller. She's such a powerful figure, but she gives him this idea of bringing together a number of folks that they're going to use for some dirty government business, essentially. Now, the Suicide Squad, if you look at the cover of this 30th anniversary edition, it has across the top a banner that says, featuring the Suicide Squad's first appearance. Is that correct? The Suicide Squad that we know today, yes, this is their first appearance, where it's made up of criminals and misfits, and Amanda Waller is in charge. Suicide Squad actually had an older history. It was an older book. It was more of a typical... when they appeared, it was more of a typical kind of a war story in a sense, but there was a Rick Flag who led the Suicide Squad, and so this Rick Flag from Legends, Rick Flag Jr. is he's the son of the original Suicide Squad commander, which in the comics continuity took place in World War II. So in this story, we have the beginning of Darkseid's plan. We have Captain Marvel discredited. We have Brimstone running around like crazy. We have Deadshot locked up in jail, and then we have Amanda Waller having Flag sent to her to start the Suicide Squad. That's just issue 1. Let's talk about issue 2. Dr. Bedlam shows back up. Darkseid has him reintegrated. He's gloating about how Captain Marvel is ruined, that this legend is ruined. And the Phantom Stranger shows up. Phantom Stranger. I love the Phantom Stranger. He is this mysterious character that has these unknown, mysterious origins. There was a comic done. One of the Secret Origins comics had multiple, backgrounds for the Phantom Stranger. There's really no definitive one. There's a lot of them that one, he's this guy who, God spared him, but for some way he has to like walk the earth and try to turn humanity away from evil. There's a variation. I've actually turned to the Wikipedia page right here on the Phantom Stranger for a minute. There's a variation where he's the Wandering Jew, which is sort of this legend that went around about a person who was sort of cursed to walk the earth and to help mankind. So anyways, there's a lot of really strange. Some people have him as a time traveler. Phantom Stranger, we could do a whole podcast on the origins of the Phantom Stranger, or the lack of origins of the Phantom Stranger. But he's this mysterious character, this very sinister character that shows up. And the weird thing about this, though, is that he's talking to Darkseid like we should understand what is going on here. It sounds like that Darkseid and the Phantom Stranger have some sort of bet going on that Darkseid can't destroy the faith in legends, or this concept of legends. But we don't see that in this book. It's probably something that happens in one of the tie-in issues, which again is one of the weaknesses of tie-in stories. If you're reading the book straight through, you miss out on these things. And I sort of had to look it up and try to figure out, was there something I was missing? But Phantom Stranger and Darkseid are having this disagreement. Phantom Stranger says that, the chaos and that Darkseid is so frustrated with, this chaos that Darkseid loathes, this is life's variety. This is the richness of life. And so they sort of have this agreement. There's almost there's almost a Job-like story going on here. There's almost this story like in the Old Testament Hebrew story of Job, where God is having this sort of a bet with Satan, and they're having this bet about will the servant Job will he give up and curse God, or will he remain faithful? And so Phantom Stranger is sort of in this role as God in that story, that he believes that, again, that humanity will continue to have faith in legends, that the legends and the heroes will persevere, and Darkseid is in the role as the adversary, or Satan, and he's saying no, that the humanity is going to fall away. We go back to the Justice League of America. They can't beat Brimstone either. So who is that now? Firestorm couldn't do it. Cosmic Boy couldn't do it. This kind of mixed group of Justice League of America, they can't do it either. So Brimstone's still running around. We cut to Rick Flag. He actually goes and gets Deadshot out of jail, and here's where we have the beginnings of the Suicide Squad we're familiar with. Tells Deadshot that if you get out, if you cooperate with what the government's asking you to do, all these charges against you are going to be dismissed. So Deadshot is now working for Task Force X. This growing anti-superhero sentiment that G. Gordon Godfrey is selling to everybody, even Batman isn't immune to this. There's a robbery at a mall. There's some people who are upset that Batman has rescued everyone. Batman comes in. I mean, there's these guys in masks, and they have Uzis, and they're holding this little granny hostage. And honestly, it reminds me of the scene from the Bill Murray movie Scrooged. At the beginning when he's showing Bill Murray's character his kind of twisted trailer for A Christmas Story. It's talking about nuclear war, highway murder. That's what it made me think of. It's like this really intimidating scene. Batman comes in. He mops up with these guys, but the police show up, and they're pretty upset that Batman's came in and rescued everybody. And who does he think he is? And Commissioner Gordon comes in, and he tries to intervene. But this mob forms, and the police are kind of involved in this too. There's this mob in the mall, and this is really weird. Gordon has to get Batman out of this mob, and they leave Robin behind. And so Robin, Robin gets pretty hurt. This is Jason Todd, so this is the second Robin. This is the Robin who later gets killed, but he comes back too. It's okay. One of the things here in this story, again, I mentioned earlier, Frank Miller had just finished, I think at this point would have just finished releasing The Dark Knight Returns, which if you ask me when in comics history does Batman become the Batman that we know today, where he plans for every eventuality, he's just relentless and unstoppable. It's probably The Dark Knight Returns that puts that idea in everybody's mind. It's not here because during this mob, with a group of civilians, somebody throws a bottle of perfume at Batman, and it blinds him, and Commissioner Gordon has to pull him out of a shopping mall, and they leave Robin behind. And I'm sorry, as a big fan of Batman, it's just really funny to see it, because that just kind of seems like a screwed up thing for Batman to do, to leave Robin and, get blinded by perfume and, get held up in a Black Friday crowd or something. I don't know. It's just kind of weird. We see lots of other random scenes too of people though, being turned against the heroes. Blue Beetle is in Chicago. He's trying to stop a drug pusher, and he gets attacked by the police because they've been trying to investigate Mr. Pusherman over here. And, they've been trying to find out who the main supplier is, and so they think Blue Beetle has, interfered and, cost them their lead. By the way, Blue Beetle was a pretty new character at this time for DC. He's one of the Charlton Comics characters that DC acquired in 1983. One of those big characters that influenced Night Owl in Watchmen, kind of Batman and Blue Beetle mixed together. Remember when DC acquired a lot of those Charlton Comics characters, Alan Moore wanted to take them and use them for Watchmen, and DC was maybe kind of okay with that at first, and then realized a lot of them were going to get killed off. So they decided no, they wanted to keep. The Blue Beetle was pretty new to the mainstream DC universe at this point. Guy Gardner, again, one of the Green Lanterns, the guy with kind of the Mo Howard haircut. There's a jet engine there's a ruptured jet. This passenger plane is going down, and so Guy Gardner saves the day. He comes in, he lands the plane successfully. Nobody gets hurt, and he lands it on a freeway in LA, and everybody's pissed off because he landed the plane during rush hour, and do you know how dangerous this was? So I think we're really supposed to see that again, that these aren't necessarily normal reactions, that the people's reactions or maybe fears of the superheroes are being exacerbated by Glorious Godfrey's influence. Here's kind of an interesting thing. So the President of the United States, who looks exactly like Ronald Reagan in this book, Ronald Reagan is here, and he's monitoring the situation with Superman. And Superman doesn't agree with this, but the president orders a ban on all superhero activities. Later on, I want to talk about the relationship with Superman and Ronald Reagan, because earlier in 1986, in The Dark Knight Returns, the president, who again looks so much like Ronald Reagan in that book, it's clearly Ronald Reagan, has a very different role in The Dark Knight Returns. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the president has decided there has to be a ban on superheroes. Is he being influenced too? Quite possibly. So issue 3, again, we have the same situations going on. We're in Titan's Tower. Beast Boy, he's going by Changeling at this point. But Changeling is in the Titan's Tower with Flash. It's also Sergeant Steel is inside there as well. When I read this was a character I really had to look up. I had no idea who Sarge Steel was. He doesn't look that descript. He's a guy with a metal hand. It's an older character. It's one of the Charlton Comics characters, again, that DC only acquired in 1983. And he seems to be some kind of government agent over superhuman activities. He's threatening, the Flash and Changeling that, if they try to escape, get out of Titan's Tower and get involved in all the chaos that's happening, he'll have to step in and stop them. And of course, they just take off, and he's kind of left like, oh shucks, what am I gonna do? We see the Suicide Squad. Assembled at this point. Their goal is to take out Brimstone. Interestingly, in this one, they're not all criminals. There only seem to be 2 people in the Suicide Squad who are being forced or at least controlled. Deadshot, who we mentioned earlier, Floyd Lawton, obviously, because he's told, he'll have criminal charges against him dismissed if he cooperates. But then there's Captain Boomerang as well, good old George Digger Harkness, who was not always portrayed as Australian, but in the 80s they really upped his Australian factor. He calls everybody cobbers, mate or pal, but kind of in a not so, not in a way of someone you actually know who they are. It's kind of like a hey bud or hey Mac or something like that. Anyways, Captain Boomerang is just, his writing is really funny. He's just so offensive to people. But anyway, so this Suicide Squad, Captain Boomerang and Deadshot are really the only 2 who seem to be there in some way against their will. Enchantress, this is the June Moon version of Enchantress. A little different, very different actually than what we see in the modern comics. The Bronze Tiger is there. He seems to kind of be a second-hand man to Rick Flag on the team. And then Blockbuster, sort of a very low level Batman and Robin villain. Another version of Blockbuster, this one's Mark Desmond. I think his brother just appeared recently in one of the Rebirth Nightwing stories as well. Anyway, so the Suicide Squad is dispatched. They're Their goal is to go to Mount Rushmore, because that's where Brimstone is at. He's in South Dakota now. I will say that the locations don't always make a lot of sense to me. There pretty clearly is a part at the end of the book where it seems like things are happening very fast, and characters like in Metropolis, and then they're in Washington, D.C., and then they're in Gotham, and suddenly somehow Brimstone was like in New York, and now he's at Mount Rushmore. I don't know. I don't know if Darkseid is teleporting him, or if this is just because they wanted to have this showdown at Mount Rushmore. Deadshot's given this experimental laser rifle. Remember, Deadshot's the guy that never misses. As a kid, Deadshot was kind of the brother that his parents didn't care for. His father was very abusive. One day his mother finally said, this is enough. And she said how she kind of spoke up and said she would like to see, her husband killed. And Deadshot decided to do that. Went up in a treehouse rifle and tried to kill his father, and ended up killing his brother instead. And so he swore from that day that he would never miss. So Deadshot is famous for never missing. So Rick Flag gives him this experimental laser rifle. It's going to penetrate Brimstone's magnetic field, and of course the rest of the team has to help get everything in place. Blockbuster, who is able to kind of physically go toe to toe with Brimstone a little bit. Well, not really, because Brimstone kills him, but Blockbuster does his best. Blockbuster gets killed, but everybody else, Deadshot's able to shoot Brimstone, take him out. Brimstone doesn't appear in much. I actually most remember him from, what's it called, Batman, Superman, Public Enemies. It was one of the DC direct-to-video animated movies from, I want to say like 2009. There was a Target exclusive line of DC Universe Classics figures that had a Brimstone Build-A-Figure. That's maybe the biggest thing I remember him from. So anyway, Suicide Squad is successful. They take out Brimstone. And we see in the the chaos and these riots that Billy Batson, again the real form of Captain Marvel, is running around. He meets a girl named Lisa amid the chaos. Her parents have gotten separated as well, but I guess they hook up eventually because Billy Batson and her are back at her home. Her parents have cooked dinner. They're talking about they're gonna help him find his guardians and whatnot. But Billy and Lisa, and there's like a little sibling as well, are watching the television, seeing G. Gordon Godfrey talk about how terrible superheroes are. And so, the dad is mad, like the little kid's playing with a Superman toy and a Wonder Woman toy, and dad throws them in the fireplace and, blames superheroes for everything. We see the aftermath of Batman leaving Jason Todd in a shopping mall. Bruce Wayne visits Jason Todd in a hospital in Gotham. Oh my gosh, Jason Todd is like beat up like crazy. These people must have, just opened him up like a new Walmart or something. But anyways, Bruce lets Jason know that he's not planning to follow the president's orders, that he's still going to be operating as Batman. Bruce looks out, he sees all the crazy stuff going on, he sees criminals who are completely out of control because they think that no superheroes are going to be opposing them right now. We go back to the White House, and President Reagan is debating, with himself whether he's doing the right thing. He's kind of confiding in Superman, and Superman sort of has this line, well, I think you think you're doing the right thing. So it's kind of clear Superman doesn't think he's doing the right thing, but again, Superman is pretty law-abiding. If he were on a D&D chart, he definitely is lawful good. At last, we see that the third part of Darkseid's plan. He was going to have Dr. Bedlam cause the chaos. He's going to have Glorious Godfrey get everybody turned against the superheroes, and now he's going to be using these monstrous robotic warhounds, like these giant robotic dogs that he's going to be using to destroy the heroes. On to issue 4. So in issue 4, again, we see more of these incidents of craziness. Count Vertigo is in Star City. He's flipping over police cars. He's causing trouble. Black Canary intervenes. Again, this is the rebooted Black Canary. The classic Black Canary. Pre-Crisis had some crazy stuff going on, but at this point it's established that the Black Canary, the one that we know and love today, is Dinah Laurel Lance. She is the daughter of the original Black Canary. There's no kind of crazy, mind mixing or mind swapping or anything going on. She was just inspired by her mother, and her mother, passed the mantle of the Black Canary onto her. Anyways, Black Canary does save these officers, but one of the officers tries to apprehend Black Canary, and his partner is, no, she helped us, you don't need to point a gun at her. The two officers get in a scuffle, and one officer ends up shooting the other officer accidentally. So kind of this really tragic scene that we see that shows us maybe that the folks who are being affected are certainly not acting rationally. There's a call out to the DC book Warlord. Again, hardly anything that affects the story, but Darkseid and the Phantom Stranger are watching this incident in Star City where one officer accidentally shoots another, and Darkseid says that humanity's goodness it's just a veneer. It's fake. It's only skin deep. And the Phantom Stranger presents Warlord, again, this DC kind of a fantasy sword and sorcery character who was an Air Force pilot who flew down in the center of the earth or something into a world called Scataris or something like that. So anyways, Phantom Stranger, I almost call him Phantom Menace. Phantom Stranger tells Darkseid that, no, consider Warlord. He's still out there fighting the good fight. So Darkseid sends his lackey Desaad to Scataris to corrupt and ruin Warlord. Of course, that's covered in one of the types that I wasn't able to read. Oh, we got the Joker in here too. Joker only has a little tiny part. This is a pretty strange little scene. The Joker, this actually is one that continues from, I think it was Detective Comics 570. I looked this up a little bit. Joker tried to do some mind control on Catwoman. So Batman's tracking the Joker down. The Joker has killed a bunch of people with Joker gas, but he's killed them for this girl who is some kind of a conceptual artist. That's what they call her, a conceptual artist. So she's some sort of like a modern artist or something. Her name is really Shirley. The Joker calls her Shirley, but she calls herself Fungus Souffle. I'm just letting that sink in for a minute. Aren't you glad that the Joker had Harley Quinn? I mean, I'm glad that Harley Quinn is on her own now, that she has left the Joker behind. He did not treat her right. She's her own person. I'm glad for that. But who knows, if things might have happened a different way, we could all be talking about Fungus Souffle. Anyways, Fungus Souffle and the Joker share a kiss. She calls him Jokey. Just gonna let that sink in as well. Kid you not. Anyways, Batman comes in. He takes out the goons. Joker quickly is like, oh, well, if you come closer, I'll shoot Shirley. So he doesn't really care about her, but we knew that already. Batman solves the problem, couple well-placed batarangs, bang, pow, woof, takes out the Joker and references something with Catwoman that happened in Detective Comics 570. Again, one of those tie-in issues that we don't have in this volume. More crazy stuff, more really crazy stuff, actually. In LA, there's a scene where Guy Gardner stops a group of bodybuilders. Like, there's these two big male bodybuilders and there's a female bodybuilder, and they're trying to break into this vault, and Guy Gardner creates some kind of monster with his ring, some kind of monster construct to freak them out. I have no idea who they are. They don't have names that I was aware of. So if you know who these bodybuilders are, let me know, because I was not able to identify those characters. The other crazy scene that happens is in Chicago. There's an antique clock show that's going on. There's this beautiful woman that walks in only a bikini. There's a bunch of old guys who start going all over her and talking her up and stuff. It turns out that she is a mechanical robot who was controlled by Kronos the Time Thief, and fortunately, Blue Beetle is able to intervene, but as soon as he intervenes, the police show up and they start chasing him again. They're still mad at him about the, ruining their lead on a drug dealer or something. So all kinds of crazy stuff is happening. We go to Salem, Massachusetts. Again, here's one of the things with this book. It jumps back and forth a lot. If you don't have at least a passing familiarity with these characters, it probably could be a little difficult to read. Not as much as Crisis on Infinite Earths or Final Crisis or anything like that, because the story's pretty simple, but it does jump back and forth with characters quite a bit. Salem, Massachusetts, you have Kent Nelson, aka Dr. Fate. He's in his tower, and he's monitoring the situation, and he finally decides that he has to intervene as well. We go back to the Suicide Squad. Flag goes against Waller's orders. She doesn't want the people released. She doesn't want, Deadshot and Boomerang released. She wants the government to keep using them. And Flag's like, nope, we made a deal. I'm going to go ahead and release them. And he does. Of course, I think Deadshot sticks around and, Captain Boomerang runs off. In Gotham, we go back to G. Gordon Godfrey. Glorious Godfrey. He's holding this massive rally, and now he's claiming that the president has called for Godfrey to be apprehended. So he's trying to incite riots. He tells everybody we're going to overthrow the government. We're going to return it to the people. And he asks the people, hey, who wants to step up and become a warhound? We don't see it fully, but we see a little bit of that giant silver robotic, dog creature that Darkseid teased at the end of the last issue. Or the issue before that. I think it was the end of the last issue number. In New York, Beast Boy and the Flash are there. Captain Boomerang is running around. He's taking advantage of all the chaos. He's causing trouble trying to steal stuff. Beast Boy and the Flash show up to stop him, and they are confronted by a warhound. And we jump in to part 5. There's only 2 of these left. And these ones have a lot of battle scenes in them, so there's sometimes not as much to talk about. Part 5, there's a riot. There's all these effigies of Superman and other heroes are being burnt by the angry crowds. Billy Batson realizes there's just too much craziness going on. He has to become Captain Marvel again, even though he swore he wouldn't. He becomes Captain Marvel again, but he is summoned away by Dr. Fate as Black Canary, Guy Gardner, Blue Beetle, Batman, Wally West, The Flash, and Changeling, and Superman, while Superman is talking with President Reagan and a couple other folks as well. At Godfrey's rally, now he's in Metropolis, and the people are chanting for Captain Boomerang to be burned. Somehow, what has happened is that Captain Boomerang has been captured, and even though Captain Boomerang is certainly not a hero, nor does he have any really special powers, he is captured, and everybody is kind of turning their aggression on him. And of course, Digger Harkness is not doing anything to de-escalate the situation. He's kind of causing trouble. Amanda Waller knows this is going on, and she does not want Captain Boomerang to somehow disclose anything about Task Force X or the work of the Suicide Squad. So she sends Flag out and gives him the option. They can rescue Boomerang or they can assassinate Boomerang, but he cannot share anything about what they're doing. Now, at the Lincoln Memorial, Glorious Godfrey is there. So again, we've gone from Metropolis to the Lincoln Memorial in a couple pages with the same characters. So Glorious Godfrey is talking about how all people are going to be equal again. He's got the Warhounds there, and Dr. Fate shows up with this crew of superheroes that he's brought. Batman, Black Canary, Blue Beetle, Wally West, Changeling, Superman, they're all there. Pretty good roster of superheroes, to be honest. Pretty cool grouping there. And they're everybody's kind of watching what's going on, and Darkseid. Darkseid is back, and he's talking with the Phantom Stranger. They're watching from Apocalypse, and Darkseid presents the Phantom Stranger with this. Well, if the superheroes are really gonna, face this angry crowd and the Warhounds, then they're gonna have to go to battle against the people that they've sworn to protect. Kind of seems like either way things happen that Darkseid is gonna win. Issue 5 ends with Robin. Jason Todd is watching on television. He's in Gotham, and he gets out of bed. He's still injured, but he puts on his Robin costume and he leaves to go join the fight as well. Which leads us to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is an all-out battle. The characters are taking out the Warhounds. Of course, the Warhounds have regular people in them who have been controlled. So they can't just destroy the Warhounds. They have to find ways to, stop the Warhounds without hurting the people inside, or remove the people, in some way, because, they're superheroes. They're not going to go around just killing random, innocent people. Martian Manhunter shows up to help. So they get a lot of help from, John Jones showing up. Darkseid, though, sends a bunch of parademons, those evil little nasty minions of Apocalypse that showed up in the Justice League. So they're flying around, they're causing chaos. The superheroes are trying to round them all up. Superman and Captain Marvel are definitely trying to round them all up before they can scatter and, be difficult to track down. One of them steals the helmet of Naboo, which is Dr. Fate's helmet that has a lot of special powers, and that's going to become important here in a second. Of course, the Suicide Squad does intervene on Captain Boomerang's behalf. They save Captain Boomerang. They don't kill him. One of the big appearances that happens in this last book, last issue, is Wonder Woman shows up. This is the first time in post-Crisis continuity that Wonder Woman shows up at large in the DC Universe. Karen Berger and George Perez, who are working on the Wonder Woman reboot after Crisis on Infinite Earths, had really been doing a lot of stuff where Wonder Woman was not yet introduced to the mainstream world. Now, when Mike Gold was working on Legends as the editor, he kind of made the comment, you can't have a giant DC crossover without Wonder Woman. But they really did not want to have Wonder Woman just pop right into this, big, massive event yet. Karen Berger and George Perez were really trying to do something new with her origin, do something really special and really introduce and establish the character. So she sort of shows up very mysteriously. Nobody quite knows who she is, but they know she's definitely on the side of the heroes and a legend herself. And so Wonder Woman shows up as well and has some really good back and forth with Guy Gardner. Guy Gardner doesn't talk to people quite nicely, and Wonder Woman doesn't really put up with a lot of crap. So pretty interesting exchange there. One of the best parts in the story is there's a group of terrorists, or I guess it would be a group of the people they're terrorists, but a group of the people who are riding, who are going to attack the White House, and they show up and they're attempting to kill the president. Come in there and there's President Reagan, and they start shooting at him. Before they shoot at him, he tells them basically, they have like so many, seconds to put down their guns and surrender because the U.S. doesn't negotiate with terrorists. And they start shooting at him, and the bullets rip his clothes, but they don't hurt him at all. And he steps forward, and he knocks one of them out with his bare hand. He bends the gun of another one, and then another President Reagan steps out from a door, and it turns out that the President Reagan who just punched out some bad guys is actually the Martian Manhunter. So there's this really cool thing where the president shakes hands with Martian Manhunter and is like, "We owe you a debt of gratitude," and he tells his people, immediately put this out there. I'm rescinding the executive order. We need the superheroes. Let them do what they need to do. And we have this scene with a final stand. The superheroes are, sitting out there. They're in the midst of a crowd of all these people who were planning for the government and, were against the superheroes. And they're kind of all in this, this heroic, big circle. And a bunch of kids show up. Bunch of kids are showing up and saying, leave the heroes alone. And, we need the heroes. And, kind of this idea that, the kids are the ones who really see that these heroes are truly legends. Lisa, Billy Batson's friend from earlier, shows up, and she's kind of talking to Glorious Godfrey and his G. Gordon Godfrey persona, and he ends up slapping her or smacking her or something, and it breaks the spell over the crowd. They see, wait a minute, dude just punched a kid. And suddenly he's like, wait, it's not what you think. And he goes and he pulls out the helmet of Naboo. So one of the parademons had to have taken it and delivered it to Glorious Godfrey. And he puts it on, I guess assuming that he'll be able to have the powers that the helmet possesses. But what it does is it actually wipes his mind. And so the spell over the crowd is broken, and they kind of realize, like, oh, they've been wrong. And there's a lot of comments about, the heroes are like, we have to earn people's trust. Guy Gardner has a really good quote. He's talking with Captain Marvel, and he says, there had to have been some seed there already for Glorious Godfrey to kind of be able to turn them completely against us. So, do the people really fear the heroes in some way? Possibly, but at this point, things have been taken care of. All the warhounds have been dealt with. Glorious Godfrey, his mind is wiped. The president has rescinded the order, and they start talking about forming a new Justice League. And from the end of this book, it looks like the new Justice League is going to be Dr. Fate, Batman, Martian Manhunter, maybe Green Lantern. Guy Gardner's kind of like, I don't know, I don't really like joining things. We'll see. Black Canary, Captain Marvel, and the Blue Beetle. The Flash says, he'll show up if he's needed. Same with Superman. He'll show up if he's needed, but I think that's kind of they're not necessarily going to join. They're going to do their own things. And the only one who gives like a pretty definitive no is Changeling, aka Beast Boy. And he says, no, I'm actually going to stick with the Teen Titans for now, which is cool. 80s era Teen Titans was a pretty strong team. And the book ends with Darkseid sort of saying, well, his plan was fine, but that humans are just too unpredictable. There's this really cool page with, all of the Superman, Batman, Black Canary, Wonder Woman, Shazam, everybody standing there, and the Phantom Stranger is sort of mysteriously hovering over them, and he says, what constitutes a legend? Is it powers and abilities beyond those of mortal men, or is it a fighting heart that refuses to acknowledge defeat? For centuries beyond numbering, from the ancient campfire to the towering condominium, man has relied on his legends to hold back the night. Men call me the Phantom Stranger, and there are those who claim that I am a legend as well. If so, I am proud to be counted in the company of such as these. And then there is a quote from the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. It says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. And then at the bottom it says, the new beginning. So, we have Legends that sets up a number of different things in the DC universe moving forward from this point. In a second, we're going to talk about a little bit about the book, what was accomplished, and what came out of Legends. I mentioned him a little bit earlier, but I want to jump back and talk a little bit about the creative team behind Legends again. So as again I said, John Ostrander was the plotter of the overall story of it, scripted by Len Wein. Again, I said, Mike Gold talks about in the afterword how important it was to have somebody who understood each character's voice. Again, Captain Marvel doesn't talk like Batman. Batman doesn't talk like Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman doesn't talk like Guy Gardner. Nobody talks like Guy Gardner. But everybody has their own specific dialogue type. And he talks about for a big crossover to get things out on time, you had to have someone who could effortlessly jump back and forth. The pencils. Now, here's one of the things I think is one of the reasons people go back to this book quite, from what I have picked up on, is the penciling is done by John Byrne. John Byrne is, I feel like he's mostly known for X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Alpha Flight, a lot of those late 70s, mid-80s Marvel stuff, but he's also known for rebooting Superman. So John Byrne was doing a lot of the Superman stuff, the reboot post-Crisis. And if there's a character who really had a lot of changes, one of the big DC characters that had the most changes, Superman had a lot of change in the sense that, again, Superman was so popular and there was so much Superman stuff, and there became, so many survivors of Krypton and so much stuff that was developed over the years, and post-Crisis kind of scaled things back. with Superman. Kind of went back to these basic elements as the last survivor of Krypton again. And so John Byrne is just, I mean, again, people really like his art. I love these like late 70s to mid 80s depictions of DC characters, and I think this is really great. You easily know who any character is. The ink in this is by Carl Kessel. One of the things I'm most familiar with is I just finished reading the DC Harley Quinn series from 2001, released the first collected edition of it. Carl Kessel was involved in that series heavily, but he inked this series, and the colors were Tom Zucco. And again, one of the things that Mike Gold mentions in the afterword is when you're coloring a big book like this with dozens and dozens of characters, you need a colorist who knows who these characters are and doesn't have to keep checking and looking back. They understand, oh, this is the color for the outfit, and this is where everything's at. So it's a really good team. If you like the style, if you like that 80s style of DC art, comics art, I mean, this is a really fantastic book. Character expressions are incredible. Again, it's a really fun book to read. It's a really fun book to look through. I really did enjoy it quite a bit. Now, again, like I said, it's a pretty simple story. I think at times there's a lot of logic here. I mean, Darkseid's plan is he's going to turn everybody against the superheroes, and that's kind of it. It's got lots of characters. There's lots of things that you can tell probably happened in tie-in books, which are, I mean, again, it's hard to track those down at this point. I mean, you'd have to order individual issues. I don't know that there's any that are, incredibly rare or difficult to find, but that's sort of tough if you're just wanting to read the story. So, Darkseid's the main bad guy, but the heroes don't ever actually confront him. They just kind of confront the parademons, and I mean, again, it's not even a physical confrontation with Glorious Godfrey or anybody except the parademons and random criminals and whatnot. So maybe in some ways that's a little anticlimactic that there's not even a real confrontation going on there. Now, if you're trying to track down the tie-ins, I think there's like 22 tie-in issues for this book. So 6-issue series, 22 tie-ins. Certainly more manageable than the 100 plus tie-ins for Crisis on Infinite Earths. Those tie-ins are not available in a collected form. It looks like that DC was gonna release those as a book called Legends Companion sometime in spring of 2017, but it doesn't seem to have materialized. I found the page on Amazon, but it sort of has that this book may not be being released or anything, so I don't know. Maybe let DC know that you really want to read the Legends Companion. A couple things interesting about the book. There are a lot of recaps at the end at the beginning of each issue. Some of the issue beginnings have like 2 and 3 and 4 pages recapping everything that has happened. That's a little unusual. I wasn't expecting to see that as much. Sometimes I was kind of thinking like, did I accidentally like go back a few pages because I know I've read this. Another thing that's really fascinating is that in issue 3, at the bottom of the page, there's sort of a recap of the whole story as well that runs across the bottom of the page. When I was first reading this, I would read that last bottom panel because it doesn't necessarily look, clearly separated. And I was like, this isn't really making a lot of sense. Why are these panels where they are? Took me a couple pages to realize that this is sort of a large recap or kind of a, bird's eye view of the story of Legends at the bottom of issue 3. Pretty confident it was issue 3. Maybe it was issue 4, but I think it was issue 3. There's a couple interesting ideas here. It's kind of this, again, that it's about the power and belief in these characters. DC was going back and rebooting these characters and trying to understand how to make these characters accessible to people. It's kind of cool to have a story that focused on the power of these characters and the power of, belief and looking up to heroes. Godfrey, Glorious Godfrey, at one point says heroes are outdated. So, sorry, one person podcast. Gotta take a drink of water every now. Glorious Godfrey says heroes are outdated. So it's kind of interesting, are the heroes old fashioned? It's cool because we have some very new heroes in this book. Well, new as of 1986. But we had some characters that were very classic too. Again, Captain Marvel. You always hear me say Shazam at first, but I know it's Captain Marvel at this in DC history. But Captain Marvel, who was a 1940s character, and yet having him be a major point of this story because he's a legend. So that was kind of an interesting thing that they looked at. There's a really good quote or really good thought put forth by Darkseid, where he's talking to the Phantom Stranger. He says, "Humanity tears down its heroes when it perceives weaknesses or faults or imperfection." So sort of this idea about, well, what does a hero mean to us? That can we see somebody who we think that they're heroic, that they've done something incredibly impressive, and when we find that they have, some fault or some weakness, when we realize that they're human, that they're fallen, that they're imperfect, that we suddenly then want to tear them down, that they're no longer heroic to us, they're no longer, worthy of our respect or anything. Again, not someone who we're saying is a hypocrite or, leading a double life or something like that, but when we see somebody who legitimately does something impressive or powerful or good, and then we find out, well, but they have flaws and faults as well. Why are we so quick to jump in and suddenly tear them down and no longer, be able to see their good qualities or something? Interesting idea. Thanks for pointing that out to us, Darkseid. Also a huge element here about the role of kids. The kids are the ones who see the truth. One of the things that comics are often always trying to do now is to bring in those new readers, those younger readers. Definitely one of the things DC was trying to do with Crisis on Infinite Earth, make things more accessible for new readers, which new readers are often young readers. But in this story, you see that some of the most important things are like that character Lisa, who comes up and confronts Glorious Godfrey and all these angry mobs. It's sort of her passion. Lately we've been seeing these young students who were in Parkland, Florida. And again, whether you agree with their politics or not, it's amazing to see these young people who were stepping up and saying what they believe in and devoting so much time and effort to it. And I don't know, it's just kind of, again, when you're reading things, you sort of connect them to things that you see going on in the world around you. And so there's something in this story about the power of youth, kind of that power of that, that unbridled, unchecked passion that you have when you're younger for something, that you're willing to kind of to stick your neck out a little more than you are when you're older and established and have multiple other things going on. Of course, with the whole other side of the coin, when you have G. Gordon Godfrey as this psychiatrist and the author of the book Superhero Super Menace, I was kind of getting a feeling a little bit of the Seduction of the Innocent, the 1954 book by Frederick Wortham. I haven't read all of Seduction of the Innocent, but this is the guy who was really focused on that comic books maybe were connected to juvenile delinquency. In the mid-50s, there was a series of congressional hearings about comic books and how they, led to juvenile delinquency and all these, these problems. That's when we had the comic code established. So maybe there's a little bit of a facetious play on some of those 50s ideas about comics being so deviant and whatnot here, as Godfrey is now poking fun at the superheroes. Excuse me, now kind of being the pundit that stirs up the panic for everyone. There's definitely a focus here on the power of media. Again, we might say that's even a more important conversation today than it would have been in 1986. But the power of the media to either inform people or to mislead people. Godfrey is this pundit who gets up there and stirs up this panic and is looking for this controversy that's not there, and trying to bring everybody down. One thing I mentioned I was going to talk about, and I will talk about it real quick before we wrap things up here, is that we have at least two that I know of, two stories where Ronald Reagan, or at least the president, as he's called in the comics, interacts with Superman. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns had ran through the summer of 1986, and in that book there is an alternate depiction of Ronald Reagan. Again, Ronald Reagan in that book is very different. In Dark Knight Returns, Ronald Reagan, again, he's very folksy, he's very grandfatherly, sort of like the real Ronald Reagan, but there's definitely a menacing side to Reagan in that book. In Dark Knight Returns, which is a very different book than Legends, Superman is a tool of the state. Superman is kind of under the authority of the state. He is sort of the establishment, sort of the crushing power of government, where Batman is kind of the liberator, the person who's coming in and championing for freedom and whatnot. In this book, Superman is sort of this this sense of goodness that the president is seeking counsel from. I mean, we get that the president knows he's president, but he's sort of seeking counsel from Superman, wondering is this the right step? I think it's very fascinating to see we have these two different depictions of President Reagan specifically, and Superman as well. And they're just so different. Superman is always usually depicted as a hero, a symbol of all of those things that are good and true and just. And The Dark Knight Returns sort of turned all those things on its head. Again, if we get the whole idea of Superman being sort of the not just the Boy Scout, but the Boy Scout who's kind of the unwittingly causes problems, or the Boy Scout who willingly works for the man. I get a lot of those ideas from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and say what you want about Frank Miller's work after that book, other than Year One, because Year One is fantastic. But The Dark Knight Returns is definitely one of the most significant comics of all time, and I think in probably so many of these things we're going to go back and talk about it, just like we're probably going to go back and talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths multiple times, and Watchmen as well. Here's Watchmen running. Watchmen is talking about superheroes in a completely different way, while Legends is building these superheroes up as these these characters that inspire hope, these characters that people look up to, that help us to get through hard times. Watchmen is deconstructing them. Watchmen is taking them apart and looking at how broken and fallen they are, and how much craziness they bring about. So very interesting to see all of these things going on in comics in 1986. So what changed? What was the result of Legends? It did reintroduce a lot of characters into the post-Crisis DC universe. We see Wonder Woman introduced in a wider way, but we see the reintroduction of characters like Captain Marvel. What spun out of the book? Well, there was a new Flash series with Wally West, which was a big thing that came out of this book. There was a new Justice League, Martian Manhunter, Batman, Blue Beetle, Guy Gardner, Black Canary, Captain Marvel and Dr. Fate. And of course, we have the Suicide Squad that came out of this as well. And again, the Suicide Squad had existed before in some way, but it was not the Suicide Squad that we think of today. Legends is not a DC book that I think you're going to hear very much about. Honestly, I sort of stumbled across it. I was looking at some things and I kind of found it. I'm not quite sure I'd ever really heard that much about Legends before. It's not the greatest story, but it's a pretty good story. I enjoyed it. Again, fantastic art, just fantastic depictions of these characters overall. It's a very optimistic story. It's a very simple story, but it's a lot of fun. So how can you read Legends? Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, DC just reprinted it, a 30th anniversary edition. And it does have that very prominent Suicide Squad first appearance banner across the top. So I'm wondering if maybe the most significant thing to come out of the book is the appearance of the Suicide Squad. You know, we have the first appearance of Amanda Waller, first appearance of Brimstone, probably a couple other characters too, but don't quote me on that. So, what's coming up next? I think the next book that I'm going to check out is taking a step back, but it's not Crisis on Infinite Earths. I'm actually going to be talking about History of the DC Universe. This is not quite a comic, but it's illustrated, and it was sort of helping people understand where the DC Universe was after Crisis on Infinite Earths. I just got it in the mail the other day. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm reading a couple other things as well right now. I'm reading Volume 2 of the DC Omnibus for Batman and the Outsiders. I just finished the DC Rebirth Lazarus contract for Teen Titans. That was a really good read, and get ready to read the third volume of Titans as well. And got a couple other comics set aside too. But hopefully, if you enjoyed this, please let me know. You know, if nobody listens to it, then this is just me talking, and I may not do it much longer. But if you enjoyed it, if you liked it, you know, please let me know. You can definitely leave me a comment when I post this on actionfigurebarbecue.com. That's BARBECUE.com. Or you can send me an email, barbecue17@actionfigurebarbecue.com. Thanks a lot. Continue to check out my website. I try to review action figures quite a few times a week. Mostly I review DC stuff and Star Wars stuff and minifigures. Lots of DC stuff on there. So I hope you enjoy those things. I just got the newest series of Mattel's DC Comics Multiverse figures. This is the Clayface series. So there's a lot of Rebirth-focused action figures in there, including the Detective Comics Clayface from the Rebirth series. And he's pretty cool. I'm looking at him right now. He's watching me and sitting here with me as I finish up this podcast. The real Brad Bell and I are getting ready to do another episode of Confirmed Epic Podcast. I'm not sure when this episode will come out because Brad sort of helps me edit these and put them up. I'm not very good at those kind of things. But anyways, before next time, this has been your tour of the DC Universe. We've talked about 1986 and 1987's Legends. And next time we'll be talking about History of the DC Universe. So from my multiverse to yours, have a great evening.